to another episode of Witty CFB. Your host, Rob Sheply here. And on today's episode, we are going to be doing a deep dive into week two, particularly picking the top 10 games of week two. Obviously with week zero, there wasn't too much going on there in terms of games. A lot of the teams, who were, favored ultimately won. But what was fascinating about week zero was that all the underdogs actually covered the spread. Whereas, going into week one, we did see a couple upsets, particularly the biggest one of note was, Virginia Tech going down versus Vandy. And I got to say, Vandy looked really good between having Diego Pieva. You had Jerry Kill coming out as an assistant coach, and also that defense has been revamped, and Clark Leah deserves a bunch of credit for that win too, because especially the past couple of seasons, it's really been a slow burn in terms of trying to develop and trying to get those key players in those various roles. But with that said, I'm going to go into the top 10 games and just do a brief analysis on the game and ultimately pick my winners. And then as we go into the year, it'll be fascinating to see, just how good my record ends up being. I mean, I would be happy with 500, but with the way college football is, it could really go anywhere from 300 to 5 to 7. So I mean, as long as I'm somewhere in the middle of the road, I would be pretty content with that. So with that said, the first game that I'm going to be covering is Duke versus Northwestern, which is tonight. And right now, Northwestern is 1.5 point favorite versus Duke. I think this game is going to be pretty close for a couple of reasons. One, yes, Duke doesn't have Riley Leonard anymore. Definitely, some of their players have transferred out. But the one thing Duke does have going for them is they did hire Manny Diaz, who is going to be running that defense. And if Duke can show up just as impressive as they did, you know, last year and the year before, kind of just super over exceeding expectations, I really do think Duke can make some noise in this ACC that's kind of been a little bit messed up considering the losses that Clemson has, Florida State, and all those teams. Where on the other side of the coin, you have Northwestern, who as you know, they had the whole controversy with Pat Fitzgerald, and now he's out, and you have Braun, who's taken over as head coach. He's really taken everything in stride and doing the best that he can to get this team going and everything. And they are building a new stadium, and for those who haven't read it yet, I'd highly recommend reading ESPN article that highlights the particulars of their new stadium, as well as a lot of the things that they're doing in the interim too. I do believe they're having a game at Wrigley Field. I don't remember what week that is, but I think it's gonna be one of those games where I think Northwestern and Duke have both definitely outperformed expectations, especially last year. Everybody kind of thought Northwestern was going to be the laughing stock of the Big Ten, but they actually had a pretty respectable year that year or last year. So with that said, even though it is a 1.5 point favorite, I'm not picking spreads. I'm just picking straight winners and losers. But for this game, I'm going to go on a limb and say that I think Northwestern is just going to edge out Duke by maybe a field goal. But I expect this to be a low scoring game. I think there's going to be a lot of great defense, and both of them kind of have some things to figure out. But I think Northwestern's going to win by about 3 or 4 points. And the next game, obviously, Texas Michigan. I did cover it on a couple episodes ago in terms of this matchup. I mean, it is at the Big House, and you can never underestimate Michigan too much. But again, when you think about the quarterback matchup between Quinn Ewers and Davis Warren, and then you think about Michigan trying to really own the line of scrimmage versus Texas front seven. To me it just really seems like a game where Texas can definitely sort of get a statement win, where if they win by a couple possessions, it would really put some more eyes on that program too. I mean, granted, they are favored by 7, so I think a lot of the odd makers over in Vegas are kind of looking at this game maybe in a similar vein than I am. But I definitely think Texas will win this game and move on and go from there. I actually think they're going to be one of the top contenders in terms of the national championship as well, which going into later the year, we'll definitely be discussing that too. Another game that's definitely been on my radar in terms of, on Saturday too, another noon matchup, which is Arkansas versus Oklahoma State. I got to tell you, Mike Gundy's been at Oklahoma State for almost 20 years, and I would have to say that, out of all the college football coaches that do end up getting talked about, I do think Oklahoma State is one of those programs that, really never gets the love and recognition that a lot of the mainstream media doesn't really, give them credit for. I get to some degree. Yes, before you were overshadowed by Texas and Oklahoma and, TCU for a time being, in Kansas State, and, a lot of and Utah and a lot of those other teams too. But, when it comes down to it, I mean, you have one of the best running backs in the country in Ollie Gordon. You have an experienced head coach who's really gone through it all. He's been there since 2005 or 6, I want to say. So you have an experienced coach. You're at home field, and Oklahoma's done a really good job with stretching out the field and making the use of Ollie Gordon too. Now I think Alec Bowman. I think he's a solid quarterback, and I think the one thing that I will give him a lot more credit for compared to last season is I think he's just a wise decision maker. He's not going to be one of those guys where you watch the tape and he is super athletic or explosive or has a super big arm or anything like that. However, he is consistently been a leader for that program. He's not going to turn the ball over very much, and he knows how to get the best out of his receivers, Ollie, and he does obviously trust Mike Gundy too. And then, when you look over at Arkansas, this is very much a team that has a lot of eyes on them, particularly with Bobby Petrino coming in now running the offense. You have Sam Pittman, who does have that offensive coach background. So those two together really showed a lot of explosiveness in terms of week one versus Arkansas Pine Bluff 2. Now, I get it, granted, you can only put so much stock into that game since they did put up 70 against them too, but I think the one thing I'd really like to mention is yes, you do have Taylon Green, so I do anticipate a more balanced matchup where I expect a lot of play actions to be ran, really being able to stretch the field. They have a bunch of dynamic wide receivers, and I think ultimately, although I do think KJ Jefferson is one of the best quarterbacks that has been there in a long time, I really do think you're in a solid position having Green as well. So because I think in general that was one of the things where once when people found out that KJ Jefferson was transferring to UCF, you really did kind of question to what extent can Arkansas kind of bounce back, and what would their offense really look like from 2023 compared to this year. And with that said, I think the one thing I will say is I do think in a lot of ways this could be a really good matchup for Arkansas. I will say if they can really get that offense going early and they can make a couple key defensive stops, particularly on third down, I do think that Arkansas could pull off the upset here. Now, granted, Oklahoma State is 10-point favorites in this game, but you're in Stillwater. You have Mike Gundy. You have one of the best running backs in the league, and right now, I just don't think Arkansas is in a position to be able to pull off this upset. I think Oklahoma State just has too much talent on the offensive side of the ball, and they've been one of the most consistent programs in all of college football for really the past 15 or 20 years. So, with that said, I'm going to go with Oklahoma State, but I wouldn't be surprised. I don't think they're going to cover the spread. I think it's going to be by less than 10 games, but I anticipate this game being a shootout. So I would say this could be a high scoring game, but I do anticipate Oklahoma State ultimately winning this game. Next, this is also for me a really fun matchup for a multitude of reasons, but Georgia Tech is going to be facing Syracuse as well. Another fun ACC matchup in the sense that Georgia Tech has really turned the corner, especially having Brent Key going into his second year. They did upset Miami last year, and obviously week one they went to Ireland and flat out dominated Florida State. And with that said too, I do think Georgia Tech has gotten a lot of great recognition, and they dominated the trenches. They can prove that they can both run and pass the ball. But I think at the same time, I do think we need to give a lot more credit to Syracuse than what people are making out to be too. Because yes, I do understand to some extent that Syracuse has definitely had, a couple seasons where expectations have not really been met. They've been kind of a middle of the road program, but they did take a big risk in hiring Fran Brown, who has, by all accounts, been known to be an excellent recruiter. And I think that's a lot more evident this year as well, where he did bring in a lot of transfers as well. And I do think Syracuse is starting to kind of turn that corner where I think we're going to see them utilizing the transfer portal and NIL a lot more than they were in years past because, for the most part, too, they are definitely kind of known more as a kind of academic school, which is, kind of in the same similar vein as Duke in the sense that have they ever been a football first school? Not always, but I do think too when you have Fran Brown and you do have that charisma and charm, and coupled with Kyle McCord coming in too, which was hilarious too. That Fran Brown gave Ohio State a shout out for being able to get him too. But in any event, I do think that it adds a little bit of a layer considering that Syracuse is home. You do have this revamped Syracuse team that I do think could cause some problems for Georgia Tech, but I think ultimately, the pan's really hot for Georgia Tech, and they've shown these past couple weeks that they're a new team and they need to be taken seriously. And there's a reason why they moved up into the top 25 this week. So with that said, I'm going to be taking Georgia Tech in a close one, but I wouldn't be surprised if Georgia Tech runs away with it in the second half. So we'll see what happens there. And then, these next games we'll do a little bit more rapid fire, but you got Iowa State versus Iowa, which always one of the most competitive rivalries in college football in general. I do think the Cyclones, will make this competitive. I mean, I will say, neither team's really been very known to, on the offensive side of the ball. I mean, it was chronicled a lot last year, particularly with Iowa having pretty much one of the best defenses in the country. But yet again, time and time again, Kirk Ferentz, keeping his son Brian until the administration pretty much made him fire him. So I do think, in a sense, that I think this matchup could be one of those games where I think Iowa can show the country that yes, they can move the ball a little bit more, and the defense is still just as strong and relevant as it's ever been. And I was surprised when I read this that the spread is only three favored to Iowa, but at the same time, you do have Iowa at home. You do have Kurt Ferentz coming back because he was suspended last week for a recruiting violation that was, in regards to getting Kate McNamara too. And I do think he's going to play with a chip on his shoulder this year, especially since last year he, had that. I think he tore his ACL. He had a really significant injury last year, and this is pretty much going to be his last season. So I definitely expect a hot and hungry Iowa team to want to make a statement versus their in-state rival. So I would say give me the Hawkeyes, and I think they're going to ultimately show that they are the best team in Iowa, and I would definitely like to see a little bit more offensive productivity on that side. Next game is the Duke Mayo Classic Bowl, or I don't know why I'm calling it a bowl, but it's a classics. But you have Tennessee going against the Wolfpack and North Carolina State. I gotta say Tennessee is going to be one of those programs that we're talking about in November that could really be one of those kind of underdog teams, that Cinderella story that we're talking about in terms of the 12-team playoff. When we think about the 12-team playoff, we think of the best beneficiaries, obviously teams who have kind of been on the top 10 pretty consistently, but would have got inconsistently year after year. We think of, in that threshold, we think of Ole Miss, we think of Penn State, but I'm also going to throw out there Tennessee as well. Obviously, it's tough because you have Texas coming in, you have Georgia, you have Alabama, you have Ole Miss there too. So, I think one could argue they're maybe the fifth or sixth best team in the SEC, but that's a testament to how strong the SEC has been over the past couple years. Now, I do think that North Carolina State is a very formidable team. Dave Doran, you got to give him some credit too, especially you know where he kind of started with that program. They've done a lot of considerable effort really, making this program a lot stronger. They did beat North Carolina last year. I will say their starting game against Western Carolina was a bit concerning because the offense definitely looked a little slower than usual. But I think to some extent, with Grayson McCall coming from Coastal Carolina, it could just be a little bit of the first game jitters that we consistently see in week one, where a lot of the games tend to be low scoring and or games where you sort of expect it to be kind of a one-sided affair. But with that said, I kind of see this game in a similar vein. I don't think North Carolina State is necessarily a bad team. I just think when you're comparing them between Tennessee and North Carolina State, I do think Tennessee is going to be okay and roll through North Carolina State on their quest to ultimately make the 12-team playoff. Now, the next game I have here is South Carolina versus Kentucky. A lot of the storylines with Kentucky were obviously Mark Stoops essentially accepting the Texas A&M job ultimately for him to, be getting enough pushback to the point where he ultimately decided to stay at Kentucky. Now, I did do a deep dive into South Carolina back in early August where I did see some legitimate issues, particularly with the offensive side of the ball. You do have the true freshman who, although is a very dynamic runner, he is still working on the mechanics, particularly being able to do those RPOs, being able to make those quick decisions, and ultimately, I see South Carolina definitely having some trouble with really stretching the field. So I definitely anticipate Sellers consistently kind of, getting those quick reads, really trying to make him feel comfortable, and also utilizing Rocket Sanders too. And, from what I saw last week, I did catch a little bit of the South Carolina and Old Dominion game. And, I think this kind of the same similar narrative that we saw with, Michigan, Idaho, etc., that, Old Dominion had a lot of chances to win that game. And, you know, I did mention this before, between South Carolina's schedule going in, and I knew they would have to kind of utilize Sanders a lot more, considering that Sellers is simply not quite there yet as a quarterback. But it's great to see more freshmen getting an opportunity to start since day one. But with that said, do I think South Carolina can make this close and competitive? Yeah, but I think Kentucky's going to slightly edge them out. I wouldn't be surprised if this game ends up coming down to the final drive. But give me Kentucky over South Carolina. And then in the next game too, we have about, let's see, three more coming up. So we have next game is Michigan State versus Maryland. Obviously you really do see this more refined Michigan State program. You do bring in Jonathan Smith, you bring in Adrian Chiles. Jonathan Kim, obviously is transferred out. I think we did see a lot of great strides on the offense side of the ball. We saw them clearly, move it throughout week one. We did see the defense for the most part not making too many mistakes, but again, this is a team that is certainly a work in progress compared to what we see on the Maryland side of the ball. I do think one thing I give Maryland a lot of credit for is, Loxley's been a consistent coach. He's the type of guy that when you listen to him talk about his vision for the program, he always says he caters his message to the player. It's never just one particular narrative that's strived over and over again. And I think you see that translated onto the field too, in the sense that they really didn't lose too many players in the transfer portal. And I got to say, Loxley is the type of guy. He's a player's coach, and he's the type of guy where if you stick with him, he's gonna reward you for being loyal to the program. And I do think Maryland has a lot of the weapons and a lot of the capability to really take that next step, and maybe even get to 8 or 9 wins this year, depending on if they can get an upset or two. But with that said, I do think Maryland is definitely favored in this game. I do think there is definitely a talent discrepancy between the two. I think Michigan State, I do think Jonathan Smith is a great hire for them, and I do think over time he's going to prove that he is the right guy for the job. But right now, Maryland just has too many weapons. They have an established program there, and with that said, I think Maryland's not going to have any issues beating Michigan State. And I'd say the next game, obviously one of the biggest games of week 2 is Colorado versus Nebraska. Now, I've really tried to avoid, going into the X's and O's in terms of Colorado. I mean, we've all heard the discussions about the media censorship and the 50 plus players who transfer in and out, and we've heard about Travis Hunter, we know about Shiloh and all of those guys. But to me, what it really comes down to is, can Nebraska make enough stops in order to set up Dylan Raiola to put up enough points? To me, this is really more of a testament of, can Colorado's offensive line give Sanders enough time to be able to reach his key players. I think that's really the matchup that we're all looking for here. I think the one fundamental issue that we saw with Colorado last year that definitely needs to be addressed this year is the offensive line was simply not good enough. And we saw, I previewed Nebraska earlier this year too, and one of the things I am consistently bringing up is that front seven is going to be really difficult to stop, and I do think that is going to be the matchup that ultimately wins or loses this game, much to the same similar vein as Texas and Michigan. But I do think if Colorado can really sort out that protection, and maybe you get in a couple situations where maybe you catch some of the Nebraska players napping on being able to get those yards after catch sort of scenarios that I'd be looking for if I was offensive coordinator Pat Shurmur. So although I do believe that Colorado is going to make this close, I see the spread is 6.5, going towards Nebraska. I think that's a pretty generous spread for Nebraska, but at the same time, after all the struggles that they've had over the past 10 years, this really is the season where they're going to have really the most, you know, where I've been talking to some Cornhusker fans, and this is the most they've ever been excited for this team, and I think the hype is legitimate, and I think Raiola is gonna show up and do just enough to win the game. But if you ask me, again, this really is going to come down to the trenches, and ultimately coming down to Nebraska. Can they stop Colorado enough to be able to translate that into points? And I ultimately think that's what's going to happen. So I would say give me Nebraska over Colorado as well. And last but not least, we got Texas Tech versus Washington State. I do think this is going to be one of the most competitive, in the sense that I think this is going to be a total shootout. I'll be the first one to say Texas Tech did not play an ounce of defense. But yet again, I would say Joey McGuire is one of those guys where, do I think he could be up and running for, some of the bigger program jobs? Absolutely. But I think at the same time, Joey McGuire, a lot of, his sort of style is in the same vein as Lincoln Riley, where so much of their talents and their transfer portal and their NILs, a lot of it has been dictated towards the offensive side of the ball, where the defensive side, it gets neglected a little bit more. However, they did, Abilene Christian is one of the top FCS schools in the country, and they played in week 1, and if it wasn't for kind of a laughable play call that Abilene Christian did in that overtime, I definitely think it could have been a game where they could have lost pretty early, and you know definitely would have been in some trouble in terms of getting to a bowl game and really making any sort of noise in this really open Big 12. And when you go back to Washington State again, it was confirmed this week that they don't have the same sort of agreement that they have with Mountain West in terms of scheduling. So what I do anticipate for Washington State is that they're more than likely going to run an independent schedule for 2025, which again, is fine in the sense that they don't really have a quote unquote, conference championship game, since, pretty much by de facto it's Oregon State. But in any event, I do think, over time, probably the best resolution for Washington State is going to be for them to just move to the Mountain West along with Oregon State, and you add those two teams there, especially when they're in that geographical footprint as well. I mean, the one thing I will give Washington State credit for is, much like Texas Tech, this game is going to be a shootout. It's going to be exciting to watch. I expect a lot of explosive plays, and I probably am not expecting too much defense. But the one thing I will say is Washington State is always a hard place to play. But even though they are favored by 2 points. I'm going to go on a limit. I think this is one of my upset picks for the week. Is that I think Texas Tech is going to turn it around and beat Washington State on the road. So those are my picks for week 2, and I hope you guys enjoy this. And until next time, I'll see you then.